This is the English Wine Collection's Wine Talks British Business podcast series. Stephen Spurrier has been involved in the wine trade for almost his entire life. His experience extends through many years, from running wine shops in Paris to now owning his own English vineyard, producing wines under the Bride Valley Vineyard name, as well as having been a writer for Decanter. Wine for Stephen can be summed up as the 3 Ps: the place, the people, and the product. Stephen recalls story after story from his career, and so in order to retain as much of the interview as possible, we have split the podcast into 2 parts so you can hear the full in-depth conversation that we had. Stephen, thank you very much for putting some time aside and sitting down with me today. It's a
great pleasure.
Wonderful to be here in your beautiful home, vineyard right next door. I mean, it's idyllic. Fill me in on your career. Where did your love of wine start and run through today?
Well, I joined the wine trade in London with Christopher's, who had a very smart shop in Jermyn Street, and they said they were the oldest wine merchant in London. Berry Brothers was founded in 1680 something, but Christopher said that their records were destroyed in the fire of London in 1666. So they got anyway. I joined them as a trainee in 64, so I guess I've been in wine for 50, 55, 56 years. But it's in my memoirs, my Damascene conversion, and this is a nice story. It was when I was 13 years old, and it was Christmas Eve in the family house in Derbyshire, and dinner with all the family. Black tie. Well, probably my first Christmas Eve in long trousers. And at the end of dinner, my grandfather said, "My boy, I think you're old enough for a glass of port." And so he asked the butler to bring me a glass, and the decanter was passed in my direction, and I poured myself a glass and tasted it and drank it. And it completely knocked my socks off. Absolutely extraordinary. So I said, "Gosh, Grandpa, what's this?" Coburns 08, my boy. And honestly, Coburns 08 meant nothing to me at all, except in those days I collected stamps. And so wine actually had a lot in common with stamps, because it had a country, it had a date, it had a name. And so in my history and geography lessons at Rugby, I could actually learn a little bit about wine. Okay. And so it was from that moment on, and I'm not joking, I sort of knew that wine was going to be my profession. And then my parents took my elder brother and myself abroad with them to France and Italy, and we went to the Bistrots and trattorias, and I experienced the conviviality of wine.
Okay.
And so that was vitally important, because here we were on our table, and around us were people chatting and drinking wine and having fun.
Sure.
And so that meant to me that wine was a pleasurable object.
Absolutely.
And that I think helped a lot, because wine was not popular really. Well, amongst families like myself, upper middle class, we drank wine, of course, but it was sort of a closed book to most of England at that time. And so, there were some wonderful old-fashioned books which I read, and I learned about wine. And I went to the London School of Economics and joined their wine society. And really, straight out of the LSE, I looked around for a job in the wine trade, and I got taken on by Christopher's as a trainee.
And when was this, sorry?
1964, February 64. And trainee in the cellars was really rather like going back to school. I mean, I hesitate to say the word now, but I was what's called a fag. And a fag has nothing to do with its current interpretation. You're a kind of indented slave to the senior people in the school. You polish their shoes and you do things like that. So really being a trainee was rather like being back at school. But I mean, I learned everything. We bottled ports, we bottled wines, And that was a training period. And then what was absolutely fantastic, Christopher's sent me, at my own expense, that was fine, abroad for 8 months in 65.
Okay.
3 months in Bordeaux, a month in Burgundy, 3 weeks in Germany, none in Italy, a couple of weeks in Jerez.
That's a great start.
A couple of weeks in Porto. And that I met the people who own the vineyards, who own the chateau, who made the wine. I met everyone from top to bottom. And it was an absolute eye-opener, because you're 23, 24 years old, and you sit on the next door table, you sit on the same table as Alex de Lichine in Chateaubriand de Lichine, and he talks to you about his wine. I mean, so that completely embedded me. That meant that I was passionate about wine.
Sure.
Passionate about the wine trade. Pretty passionate about France too. Yeah.
And where did you go on from there?
Well, then I had stayed after training in Christopher's. They didn't take me on in their shop in Jermyn Street. And I joined a small company called Murray & Banbury, and we imported some really good, really great wines and some really kind of funky wines, sort of French country wines. We imported wines from the Loire that no one had really thought of. And then Bella and I got married in January 68. And by that time, I'd left Murray & Banbury. I left them, I think, in the summer because I didn't know. Anyway, yes, I know why, because I bought a property in the south of France. That's why I bought a ruin. I bought a ruin in the south of France, and I knew at some point I was going to have to redo this ruin. I had to say right now, I had quite a lot of money. I inherited the family company, which was a sand and gravel company, was sold for a considerable amount of money in 64.
Where was that based?
In Derbyshire.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And I got a considerably large check. I mean, really a lot of money. And so I didn't need to work. I have a very strong work ethic. I had no intention of not doing something. But I didn't need to work in a remunerative job. So I bought this property in South France, meaning that at some point I'd do it up. Belle and I, who had been going up some time, get engaged. I said, would you mind if we lived in the south of France? She said, well, why not? This is swinging London, you know, in the 1960s. And Bella kept on saying, why not, to most things in my life, until
it was a good time then.
Until I proposed that we plant vines on her farm here in Dorset, where we are now. And I said, why don't we plant vines on the farm? And she didn't say, why not? She said, as long as you pay for it.
Subtle difference.
Yeah, that's the difference. Yeah. So anyway, we moved from 68 until 70, we were in the south of France. Okay. And that was actually, we didn't get the building completed by any means. We had a crooked architect. I was very young. I was ripped off and so on and so forth. But it was a lovely 2 years of our lives, 2.5 years of our lives. We were very young. I'd just been through the swinging 60s, a little bit burning the candle at both ends.
Having fun.
Having fun, yeah. and we were on this lovely property in Provence, in the Var, above Fréjus, and friends used to come and stay. It was magic because, you know, you do that when you're very young.
Of course.
And then it wasn't working out. So Bella said, what do we do now? Should we go back to London? And we'd still kept a house in London.
Okay.
And I said, no, I'm not going back to London with my tail between my legs, having made all the effort to come out of France. We'll go to Paris and I'll get a job in the wine trade. And so we went to Paris and there was no wine trade, or not in the London sense. There were no importers. There was no structured wine trade. There was a little shop on every corner.
Okay.
A Nicolas shop or just a wine shop. So almost immediately, I knew that I would have to buy a shop.
Okay.
There's no possibility of employment. And my French was adequate, but certainly not good enough to be employed by an established wine shop. And so, walking up a little passageway near the Madeleine with a lawyer friend of mine, we passed a wine shop called Carbon Madeleine. And I looked at it and I said, Christopher, that is my dream. A little shop like that, I know exactly what I could do with it. And we were going up to have lunch in a restaurant, which I subsequently bought, and that was a great mistake. But the wine shop wasn't. So he dragged me by the arm, took me into the shop. And while I looked around the shelves. There were some nice wines, but nothing very special.
Okay.
And the shop, was even smaller than this room, really. And eventually the proprietress, an elegant lady, said, "May I sell you something?" In French, of course. And my lawyer friend replied in French, "Yes, my friend would like to buy your shop." And it was for sale. It was for sale. It had been on the sale for 2 years because her husband had died of cancer and he'd been a very good caviste. And so we did a deal with Manor Fougère, and then she began to have second thoughts.
Okay.
In the sense that she couldn't see how a very young Englishman who didn't speak very good French could carry the memory of her late husband. And she said, I don't think I... Anyway, she backed off.
Right.
And I said, look, Manor Fougère, I'll propose you a deal. And we were in October. I said, I'll work for you for 6 months for nothing as a caviste, really doing everything, a dog's body. And if after 6 months you think I can honor the memory of your late husband, we'll do the deal. So we shook hands on that.
Uh-huh.
And on April the 1st, April Fool's Day, 1971, she handed me the keys to the cash desk. And I placed an advertisement in the in the Herald Tribune, which was everyone's favorite newspaper. And it read, "Your wine merchant speaks English, call Stephen Spurrier." And in those days, Paris in the 70s, early 70s, had a much, much bigger proportion, or much more important proportion, of American banks and law firms than it has now. I mean, they're all there in certain, but I mean, every bank was there. Chemical Bank, Chase Manhattan, they were all there. And my telephone didn't quite ring off the hook. But, the telephone rang. "Hi, is that Steve? Yeah. I just saw your ad." And immediately, so during the 6 months that I've been working, bottling, I have to say that for little shops like this, even though it was in the Madeleine, the social status of a caviste, wine merchant, marchand de vin, but somebody who ran a little wine shop was almost the same as a petrol pump attendant. Okay. Because people used to come into the shop with an empty bottle and say, "Fill it up." And we had tanks. Manor Fougère had tanks at the back of the shop, and they used to fill the bottles up from that. And so I decided that was not the way I wanted to go at all. And 2 days after I'd taken over the shop, the sales representative from the bulk wine company came in and said, "I'm pleased you bought Manor Fougère's shop. I hope you're going to carry on with the bulk wine." And I said, "No, I'm not. The tanks are going out. Tanks are being taken away tomorrow." And he said, "Mr. Spurrier, you'll lose half your clientele." Okay. And I said, "That's the half I want to lose." So, and I lost them. Well, we did have we bought Vin Lunaire in bottles.
Okay.
Quite nice stuff, Prefontaine. But I didn't want to have any of this. And basically, within 3 months, I changed the entire atmosphere in the shop. I was told I was the only caviste who ever wore a tie. And I wore a suit and tie the whole time. And so the Englishman in Paris running a wine shop in the Madeleine, people began to talk about me.
In a suit and tie.
Yeah, exactly. But it was I knew exactly. I mean, the training I had in London with Christopher's, all the books I read, particularly the 9 months I spent abroad in the vineyards, I knew a hell of a lot about wine. I knew a lot more than 90% of the other cavistes in Paris.
Okay.
There were 3 wonderful ones. There was Jean-Claude Bess, Jean-Baptiste Chaudet, and Lucien Legrand, who I worked with a lot. But it was we were in the Madeleine, and the Madeleine was a very English-speaking middle of Paris. It was called the Golden Triangle with all the expensive shops and firms. And I could not, location. Sure. I could not have been better. And it was in this lovely sort of muse between the Rue Royale, which leads from the Place de la Concorde to the Madeleine, and the Rue Boissy d'Anglas, where you have the Crillon. And I could not have been better placed. So my American clientele, or my American Anglo-Saxon, and all the embassies were in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. So
you're right, couldn't be a better place.
Yeah, we supplied the embassies. So it was magical, and people say, wasn't it difficult running a wine shop in Paris? It wasn't difficult at all. It was heaven on earth. We had such fun.
And then carrying on from there?
Well, carrying on from there, my clients used to come in the evening, and I always had a bottle of wine open, something I just bought or something like that. So they used to have a tasting, and I never sold wine. I said, try that, I think you'll like it. And they did like it, because I never bought a wine that I didn't like. And then one of them said, I wish you could put this into a more structured form. We'd love to do a wine course. We'd love to learn about wine. And the premises next door, and to come back again, I had the money, came free, and I took it over and opened L'Academie du Vin. And that was, I didn't intend to call it L'Academie du Vin. My aim was to call it L'Ambassade du Vin, because I didn't consider myself a teacher or an educator. I consider myself an ambassador, a communicator. Yeah. In fact, the theme throughout all my life in wine has been communications, has been to communicate about wine. But anyway, the name L'Ambassade du Vin was taken, and L'Academie du Vin was not taken, because an academy in France is somewhere that you aspire to when you're 80 years old. And it wasn't something that somebody could turn into a commercial enterprise. So I called it L'Academie du Vin, wine school, the first private wine school in France.
Yeah.
And we were full almost from day one. I gave the courses. My partner, American partner, Patricia Galley, gave the courses. We had my partner, John Winroth, gave the courses. And then we gave courses in French. I didn't. And we were the only game in town in terms of where you could learn about wine, and where you could learn about wines from all over the world, really, because we contacted the Australian embassy for the Australian wines, the Chilean embassy for Chilean wines, Spanish embassy for Spanish wines. I bought sherry from the Wine Society in England. We were very adventurous, and everything seemed to work.
And the other wine shops weren't exploring these other sites?
The other shops in the Madeleine, you had Fauchon in the Place de la Madeleine, you had Ediard in the Place de la Madeleine, you had, they were very smart. They weren't worried about me in the slightest. And then the cavistes, like Legrand, Chaudet, and Bess, and a bunch of others, I got to know them. I went to see them.
Okay.
And they basically, the cavistes didn't really talk to each other very much. And suddenly there's this young Englishman who comes in and talks to them. And they were very nice to me.
Yeah.
And often I tasted a wine in their places, and then I said, may I approach the producer, because I'd like to buy this wine? Bien sûr. And so, I learned a lot I got a lot of wines from my shop by going to see the 3 best cavistes in Paris and asking their permission if I could buy from their vigneron. And then I used to go weekends. We used to go wine hunting at weekends, so that sort of thing. So it was magic, and it was great fun to be young. Well, it was magic helped by being young.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful period.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And then the Judgement of Paris. I mean, that's. Should we talk about that?
By all means, carry on if you like. Yeah.
Okay. Because we had this tasting room and we spoke English, California vintners used to come bringing their wines. And I'd never tasted Californian wine before. And Patricia Gallagher, who was American, her family had come over early on, not quite the first settlers, but they'd come over to America in the early 18th century. And she was very proud of America. And she was very upset that you couldn't get American wines in Paris. Every July 4th, she tried to give a tasting of American wines and couldn't find it. Anyway, so California producers and then American wine writers like Alexis Bespaloff and Frank Pryal and Robert Finnegan came to the shop and introduced me and Patricia to California wine. And we were bowled over, Chardonnay, Cabernets.
Okay.
And I said, Patricia, we really must do something about this because we haven't heard anything about California wine. And if we haven't, then no one in Paris has.
Of course.
And she said, right, I've got some vacation time in September. I've got contacts in California. I'll go over. So Robert Finnegan, who is based in San Francisco, basically showed her around, and she went to Stag's Leap wine cellars. She went to Montelena. She went to half a dozen people and did a recce and came back raving, saying, we really must do something. I said, okay, Patricia, but this is way beyond anything we've ever done. And we need a peg to hang it on. Mm-hmm. This was late 75, let's say 75. She said, I got the perfect peg. Next year is the bicentennial of the American War of Independence. Right, and I said, well, Patricia, we Brits don't normally celebrate having lost the colonies, but I'll go along with that.
Yeah. And
that was the most perfect peg because it was hands across the sea.
Yeah.
And then we invited 9 judges, Aubert de Vilaine from the Romilly-Conti, Pierre Tarry from Château Giscourt, Pierre Bréjou from the Institut des Arts Places and Contrôlés. I mean, 9 of the best and most informative palates in France, plus Jean-Claude Vrignard from Taillevent and Raymond Oliver from the Grand Verfort. So we had restaurants, we had a spread of very important palates. And Belle and I went to California for Easter, which was early April, to make the final selection. And I went to Ridge, where Patricia hadn't been. Martha's Vineyard.
Oh, yeah.
Heights. Yeah. I went to Heights, where Patricia hadn't been. And then I made the final selection of 6 Chardonnays, 6 Cabernets, young vintages, of course. People said, why didn't I choose the great established vineyards like Mondavi and Beaulieu? And they said that after the event. And I didn't, because I wanted to buy from what we called boutique wineries, family wineries.
Okay.
Where the owner was hands-on. He made the wine.
So you really sought out the wines.
Yeah. And I bought all the wines. I mean, people I went to see didn't really understand. I said, look, I'm going to give a tasting of these wines in Paris. I'd like to buy a couple of bottles. I guess we bought the bottles. And then luckily, there was a wine group coming with Andrei Chelichev and people like that coming to Paris. There were 22 of them, and I had 24 bottles. And there's no way I could have got my 24 bottles into France of California wine because the French customs just wouldn't have accepted it, although it would have caused a big problem. So this group hand carried the wines with them
really?
on the airplane.
Okay.
Well, and they were in boxes, but they were responsible for them. So if it hadn't been for that group, we probably wouldn't have got the wines and there wouldn't have been the tasting. And anyway, the final piece of the jigsaw was that about even 10 days before the tasting, I said to Patricia, I'm worried that if they just taste California wines, which they've never tasted before, Aubert de Villaine would have because he was married to a girl from San Francisco.
Yeah.
But they would certainly like them, but they might damn them with faint praise, saying, well, c'est pas mal. They would know that California was on the west coast, north of Mexico, so it's a hot country.
Yeah.
And if they had in their minds that California was a hot country, the wines would start off with a handicap.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I'm going to turn it into a blind tasting. I'm going to put the 4 best white Burgundies I've got at the shop in there and the 4 best red Bordeaux. And Patricia said, you can't do that because they're coming to taste California wines. They're not coming for a blind tasting. I said, don't worry, I'll fix it. So I chose Mouton, Haut-Brion, Montrose, and Les Velasquez, same vintages, 70, 71, things like that. Bonne-Clé des Mouches, Pouligny-les Pucelles, Meursault-les Charmes, and Baton-Maraché. And when the tasters appeared, I said, you've come to taste California wine, and I'm very pleased you're here. And I thought it would be more interesting if we could taste them blind against the benchmarks from Burgundy and Bordeaux. But I need your permission.
Of course, yeah.
They said, pas de problème. Of course they did. Of course they did, because it was much more interesting. And the wines had been chosen random. I just put the name of each wine on a bit of paper, screwed it up, put it in a hat, and some they took the name, some of the hat. So I didn't know. I didn't judge. Neither Patricia rankings nor mine were taken into account. Even I didn't know the ranking, the order in which the wines would be served. So the rest is history, in the sense that people are still talking about the Judgement of Paris. I mean, they never basically stopped talking about it. And it's 45th anniversary next year. But what is fascinating is in the whites, 6 judges put Chateau Montelena top. 3 judges put Chateau Chalon top. Not Chateau Chalon, Chalon. My marks are on. My bet for the whites was Chalon, and my bet for the reds was Ridge. Which means that not a single judge voted for one of those prestigious white Burgundies. Then I think, because I announced the results of the whites while the whites were being cleared away and the reds were being prepared, I think they paid much more attention to the reds. And a couple of the tasters, when they found a wine which they knew was from California, they gave it 4 marks out of 20. Well, you don't do that.
No, of course.
I mean, you don't do that. I mean, But anyway, they just decided to. But Stagsley Vineyards, that's the wine cellars, snuck through, and it was from 4-year-old vines. And I think some of the tasters voted it highly because they thought it was French. It was the most French wine on the table.
Yeah.
And very youthful. And so that came first, then Mouton, and fifth was Ridge. There were 2 wines in the top 5. So that was really what made history. I mean,
of course.
Had it just been the whites, it would have made a small amount of history. But the fact that it was both white and red,
of course,
left. I mean, extraordinary. And it's a tasting which, in George Tabor's book, he says the tasting that revolutionized the world of wine, where it did, in the sense that it completely leveled the playing field. It was the first chink in the French armor. French wines had completely ruled the world. And the bright people from France went to California. They went to see what the hell was going on. And it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that the first vintage of Opus One, the joint venture between Philippe de Rothschild and Robert Mondavi, was 1979.
Okay.
And I'm sure that Baron Philippe would not have gone into partnership to make a wine with Mondavi in Napa had it not been for the Judgement of Paris. But to wrap it all up, and then you must ask more questions because I've been talking so long.
Not at all, it's fine.
The legacy, the great legacy of the Judgement of Paris is not just for California. It created a template whereby little-known wines of quality could be judged blind against highly known wines of quality. And if the judges were themselves of quality, the opinion of the judges would be respected. And that template has been reproduced all over the world all the time.
Yeah. But it's a very sensible template to use. The judges will bring the credibility to tasting them.
Absolutely, yeah.
That concludes the first half of the interview with Stephen Spurrier. The second half is available in the following episode of Wine Talks British Business.